Anyone who's ever done anything worth doing has dreamed big, failed mightily, and mostly started from humble beginnings. This is a podcast about such people. The most fascinating podcast in the world is fascinating because of the stories of the human beings. Hello, Nick. It's nice to see you.
It's always a pleasure to be with you, Pat.
Thank you. I'm here with Nick Donofrio today. Nick is a world-renowned executive, spent 44 years at IBM. He is a native New Yorker from Beacon, New York, and he is an electrical engineer with degrees from RPI and Syracuse. I like to say Nick was raised in the Italian tradition. He had two loving parents, and Nick is married to Anita, and they have a son and a daughter. And Nick has recently written a book titled If Nothing Changes, Nothing Changes, which I have read, unlike a number of people who have interviewed you. And I have a funny story. Years ago, I was having lunch with a guy named Bob Laser in Albany, and he was the head of the New York Business Development Corporation, which was essentially a bank. And it's now called Pursuit. And I was approaching a number of banks, and he said, well, if you are approaching banks, you should meet Nick Donofrio, and he's on the board of BNY Mellon. And I said, well, how do I meet Nick? And he said, I don't know, but I think he knows John Kelly, who's on the board at Union College where you went. And so then I saw John Kelly, and I said, do you know Nick Donofrio? And he said, Nick trained me. He said, I've known Nick my entire career. Nick's great, wonderful person, et cetera, et cetera. And then I met a third person who knew you and said the same thing. And then I took a boat with my wife, Jen, from New York City to Albany. And it was a big boat, and we made a number of stops. And we were stopped at the Rondout Creek in Kingston. And I was on the dock smoking a cigar with another man who was a recent retiree from IBM. And I said, do you know this guy, Nick Donofrio? And he said, yeah, I know Nick Donofrio. He saved IBM. And I said, I have to meet this guy. And so then, as you recall, I called you, and your mom was in the hospital, and it was not good timing. And in a nice way, you said, buzz off, kid. And so then I wrote you a handwritten note, and then you called me and said, that was a really lovely note. I'll get together with you at some point, but I have my hands full at the moment. And so that's got to be 10 years ago or more at this point. And so we've been having breakfast or lunch ever since, and I very much appreciate it always. And I always learn a lot when we're together. But I wondered, before we get started today, if you could just tell me about, I read it in the book, of course, but tell me about your earliest memories. What do you remember from your earliest memories of your life in childhood?
Number one, Pat, it's a great story about how we got together, and I think it's indicative of who I am. So I am persistent. To your point, I do answer my own mail. If you take the time to reach out to me and to write to me, then you deserve an answer from me. And I know other people have different views of that. But perhaps that's because of my upbringing, in that strict Italian Catholic family, ghetto-ish kind of upbringing in Beacon, New York. Ghetto-ish in the sense that there was an Italian ghetto. And at one point in time, I think I was related to every other person in Beacon because we have cousins upon cousins upon cousins and aunts and uncles. The earliest memories I have, and this will sound a little strange, kind of focus on actually who I am and what I did, Pat. Early on, I figured out through a series of different events, relationships that my father had with other people, I did figure out that the world was going to electrify. I mean, we had already done a tremendous amount of electrification For instance, the New York Central Railroad, which is now called Metro North, was electrifying its train tracks. And I knew one of the engineers who was my father's friend from Beacon, by the way, who also went to RPI.
Hmm.
And he was busy doing that. He was busy literally helping New York Central start to electrify, the train system. So something stuck in my mind, that this was important. This was, and I'm of that era. Remember, I'm a pre-baby boomer. Are you sure you really want to know me? I mean, as a
Hmm.
pre-baby boomer. So
Hmm.
um, it stuck in my mind that I had to get hold of this and do something with it. That this very likely was going to be my life. Um, and coming from a very relatively poor Italian family, one of four children, the pressure was on to achieve, to succeed, to well, do good while doing well, do well by doing good. That whole push was on. So I was kind of early on possessed with, I think I'm going to be an engineer. I think I'm going to be an electrical engineer. And not knowing where it was going to go, but knowing something was afoot, Pat. Something was afoot. That kind of stuck with me. And then a lot of other things filled in around that. Um, my father taught us the ethic of very, very hard work. You couldn't work enough jobs, according to my father. I mean, he worked 3 or 4 himself, and my brother, between my brother and I, we each had to have a couple of jobs. I delivered papers, as you know, having read the
Hmm.
book for 5 or 6 years, roughly 100 newspapers every day after school, 6 days a week, including
Hmm.
Saturday. So, but those things worked out for me because I ended up, as you know, securing one of the Gannett News scholarships, and that's how I afforded to go to RPI, was through that
Hmm.
Gannett News scholarship. So, uh, you know, there was something, and you know this too, given your background. There was something propelling and compelling going on in my life, and I didn't I didn't understand it. I wasn't trying to orchestrate it, but I felt it. And then, as we discuss in the book, a lot more of that seemed to happen. Like, how did I get here? Like, why did the sequence of events turn out to be the way they did? Why did I start out in one place in IBM in 1964? And why did I then move on the path that I moved on, seemingly collecting all of that experience and compiling it into your comments from your cigar smoking friend about
Yeah.
he saved IBM. Like, how did all that happen, Pat? Remember, I
Hmm.
started out as an electrical engineer, a circuit designer, became a chip designer, process designer, system designer, including software. Like, where did all that come from? We give a lot of credit to RPI and we give a lot of credit to Syracuse, but that, I mean, they didn't teach me all those things. They taught me
Hmm.
they taught me the basics
Hmm.
of how engineers think, of how you solve problems as an engineer. I mean, I am forever in their debt for building that into my persona and my approach to life. I became a problem solver, and
Hmm.
maybe that was the bigger story, that I didn't quite realize that it wasn't just being a good electrical engineer. It wasn't just kind of grabbing hold of the next wave of writ large technology, but it was, hey, being a problem solver is what life is all about, and
Hmm.
trying to not create problems, as you solve problems, it
Hmm.
is really maybe the message to live your life with. Does that make any
Hmm.
sense to you, Pat?
Oh yeah. for sure. Um, when you think in terms of problem solving, you give your dad and mom lots of credit. Um, can you talk about your dad and his problem solving ability?
Yeah, so here's a guy who very poorly educated, never graduated from high school, left in the 10th grade. Um, Tough guy, a little tougher than me, my size, not big, but really physical kind of a guy in the sense that um, he was a guard, at a criminal institution for his entire life, 35 years, Mattawan State Hospital for the criminally insane, then is what it was called in Beacon, New York. World War II, um, mechanic, actually an Army Air Force mechanic before the Air Force even existed. So a rough and tumble kind of guy, fun loving guy, liked to party, but worked hard. Um, I always thought inside my father was a smarter person that he never really wanted you to get to know, for whatever reason. I think as he grew up, especially in that Italian ghetto setting in Beacon, that's not what his friends wanted. That's not, what his crowd did. His crowd, you know, kind of the kind of people. They founded a firehouse. They built it strong, mace, hook, and ladder. He was one of the first presidents, captains, whatever they were called then. Fought a lot of fires. I mean, they're that kind of a crowd. Knew what good was, but they also partied hardy, kind of a people. Um, Tough guy, very tough guy. Uh, Pushed us very very hard. My brother, myself, my two younger sisters. Made sure that we were always engaged. You know, but like a lot of families, for whatever reason, he kind of picked on me the worst, the most, whatever you want to say. Um, Whatever he saw in me, maybe more of himself in me. Um, I mean, we did things together eventually, but nothing was ever good enough, and it was always work harder. Understand what's going on, just engage, be occupied. And of course, the phrase that we use to title the book, if nothing changes, nothing changes, comes from him.
Mm,
It's not my words, it's his words. Uh, that title wanted to be edited 100 times, Pat. I mean,
mm,
my kids didn't like the title, my
mm,
wife didn't like the title, everybody thought the title was wrong. And I said, yeah, probably is wrong, but that's what your grandfather said, So
mm,
I stayed true to his words, and that became my mantra, my motto at IBM. Most IBMers
mm,
who knew me know that. I use that phrase all the time, and told my story about my father and how he pushed me and
mm,
how was he administered, in the truest sense of the word, tough love.
mm,
And I think I mentioned this to you if I didn't say it in the book. I mean, the first time he ever said, "What a great job you did, son," was when I graduated from RPI.
mm,
I took the stage to receive the degree for the class of 1967, electrical engineering, because I was the class marshal.
mm.
Um, and he cried.
Mm. That's
So
great.
that's the guy. That's the guy you learn to love. That's the guy you learn to fear, because in typical Italian fashion, uh, it was paka paka lagul. If you didn't get it right, you got a little bit of a beating. So
Mhm,
I'm not condoning that. I've certainly tried not to live my life that way, but you you had a sense from my father, Pat,
mm,
that he was a tough guy. He was probably a better guy underneath. than anybody ever got to know. And
Mm.
maybe I got as close as anyone to understanding
Mm-hmm.
that.
That's great. When you think back to RPI, like I always picture you in a lab at RPI for some reason.
That's good. I was so good. You got it right.
So, in the book and in your life, knowing you, this theme of cooperation and collaboration comes through over and over and over. Um, when you think back to undergraduate, were you cooperating at that point, or were you a little bit of a rugged individualist, or what was it like back
That's
then?
a very good question. So, I mean, in addition to winning the Gannett News paper carrier scholarship, I was also blessed because I competed for and won an IBM co op position. So, in those days, back in 1963, 64, the co op program at RPI was very selective. It was maybe 100 out of the entire class were going to be in the co op program, maybe less. You had to compete by grades, and then you had to compete by interview. Um, the co op program saved, again, a lot of grief in my family. My education was completely paid for, Pat.
Mm,
By the time I graduated, I had no debt. Um, no, it wasn't as expensive then, but also families didn't make a lot of money then either. So, and again, I'm one of four children. Um, that co-op program taught me so much. Uh, it was probably the next wise thing I did. After being a news carrier, a newspaper carrier, early on, was to compete for and win that position. I had a choice. I could have gone to work for a couple of companies. I chose IBM. My mother, of course, had great
mm,
influence over my logic and reasoning to accept IBM. Um, but I learned so much about myself. I learned so much about the world, not just academically what was going on from RPI's perspective, but also, hey, this isn't the way it works in the real world. Whatever you're trying to say to me, it makes book sense, but that's not the way it works. Here's the way it works. This is what you have to
mm,
do. System 360 had just been announced, Pat, in 1964. I was working on it. I me, a basic nobody.
mm,
I had to go to school at RPI the summer between my freshman and sophomore year to actually gain more experience. And then I went to work for IBM that fall. So I was out of phase. So
mm,
I literally was by myself in the summer.
mm-hmm,
And then that fall, I was home working for IBM. Then I had to reintegrate myself in the class, in the second semester of my sophomore year, which worked out. I mean, it all worked out for me, but there's some lonely times. You're
mm,
sacrificing. You're by yourself.
mm-hmm,
You're scratching your head all the time, like, is this really what life is all about? What am I doing?
mm,
But it became obvious to me, Pat, that there was, I was in the right place. That there was a there that I had chosen wisely. And I got more and more excited the further into the IBM assignments I got. I started to learn more, understand more, fully understood and grasped the power of technology and what was going on, and how to make things better. So I I think the RPI scene, and yes, I did work in a lab, by the way. I worked for Pepe Borrego, Dr. Borrego, God rest his soul, one of the nicest, smartest, best professors I ever had. And I was blessed. So I put experiments together for him. Um, they none of them probably worked bad, but it didn't bother him. It was like,
mm,
okay, you're learning, Nick. That's all that matters. You're learning, Nick. And he really did kind of underpin the way I thought about things. Um, he had a very interesting approach to teaching and helping you remember. you could take his quizzes without ever taking the course, because
Mm.
his quizzes would actually come up with a different a parallel theory of the case for what he was trying to teach, but he would teach what you needed in the quiz. So
Mm.
you had to read like two paragraphs before you could answer the first question. But if you were smart enough to actually understand what you were reading, you could answer the first question. Um,
Mm.
I've never seen another professor do that, to be honest with you. He taught me so much
Mm.
in the way I put my own thought process to work. So yeah, I think the base level of uh, understanding as an engineer came from RPI and from professors like Dr. Borrego,
Mm.
and the good co-op assignments I had with IBM. Remember, there were three of them, and of course,
Mhm.
the fact they paid you very well.
Mhm.
Living at home, getting paid. You know, my like I said, my education was not a burden for my parents, and I wanted to
Mm.
make sure that that was the case, Pat.
Mhm. So it sounds to me like you were a little bit of an individualist at that point, like that there was
Yeah,
less
probably.
sort of cooperation with
Yeah,
other students,
yeah,
and then of course you're between two worlds. You were
right.
between the professional world and RPI. And so I think we fast forward a bit, and now we're in Burlington, Vermont,
Yeah,
sort of your first I guess postgraduate job. Meaning you had graduated from Syracuse
yeah,
at that point, if
yep,
I'm not mistaken.
I did. Mhm.
And you had your team, and maybe you were still a rugged individualist at that point, or a little bit of one. And then you tell a story in the book about a performance review. Can you talk about that a little bit?
I can. But let me double back on your last point because I see where you're
Mm.
going, Pat. Um, this idea of individual performance, you're spot on. I mean, clearly that's my father pushing. Um, but my father was also, he was a social person. So he was very integrated into a lot of, organizations where he shared a lot of things with other people. So I think my early going here was this idea of being an individual, but also being able to get into and get out of relationships. And I thought that that co-op assignment, while at RPI, taught me that. To be honest with you, because you were number one. I was by myself that summer, so that's kind of like you're on your own. But then I had to integrate myself into this new IBM team that I had no idea what they did until I got there, and I did some of the best technical work of my life, to be honest with you, with them. And then I had to reintegrate myself back into the RPI team when they already made all their friends. I mean, I'm showing up second semester. Um, and then I had to
Mm.
do that two more times. So your point is well made, but I guess I developed this ability, Pat, to be able to reintegrate myself, to realize
Mm.
that I'm not alone. Now you carry that forward up to Vermont to my first, you're talking about my first management job. So I
Mm.
had already done some pretty cool technical things, which is why they gave me this opportunity to be the manager. They moved the entire mission from the Mid Hudson Valley up to Essex Junction, Vermont. We often call that Burlington.
Mm.
And these were my friends. These were my people. I was integrated well with these people. I led the team. I was the chief circuit designer for several chips. Um, we played golf together. We played together. I helped one of the guys move his goats, to or sheep, I forget which they were, to Vermont. He was moving his farm up there because he was being moved up there.
This is the goat story is not well known.
Yeah. So we did a lot of things to help each other, to your
Mm-hmm.
point. And I'm their manager, and the way it works in that part of IBM or at IBM at that time, annual opinion survey. And I had a opinion survey, so my team gets to rate and score everything about them, including me and my management and up the chain. And it's very well understood that you know you have to do well in these opinion surveys. I mean, you're trying to become a better manager, a better leader, and I was oblivious to what I was doing. I was Nick the engineer. I really wasn't Nick the manager. I was Nick the friend. I really wasn't Nick the manager. Um, my opinion survey was terrible, perhaps the worst in on the Burlington Essex Junction site. And I remember telling my wife Anita, I said, I could lose my job. It's that bad. I think one is terrible, five is good, something like that. I think I got like a 1.1 or 1.15 or something like that. Just horrible. And you're supposed to then get the results, read the write-in comments, and then sit down with the team without threatening them in an open environment, collaborate with them, and find out how do we get it better? What do you want to do? Without anybody feeling compromised. I'll never forget. I went to that meeting, Pat. Different attitude. I said to them, "Look, I have no idea whether IBM is going to allow me to keep my job. I really don't. But I want you to know, I'm sorry. I truly am sorry. I have totally screwed up. It's my fault, not yours. I wasn't listening. I was telling. I actually did your jobs. I actually know your jobs. And that's my burden and problem. I've got to listen to how you want to do your jobs. So if IBM is willing to let me stay, are you willing to let me continue to be your manager?" I'll never forget that. And we had a good conversation. They told me what a jerk I was, and all the stupid things that I did and why I was upsetting to them. I pivoted, Pat. I moved that day to be the person you now know, someone who understands I'm no longer doing, I am enabling. I'm enabling you to be your best. You have to tell me what you want, tell me what you need, tell me where you are. And there's a lot of this in the book. This idea of being forthright and forthcoming. Just tell me the truth. Tell me you're in trouble. Tell me you're not in trouble. Tell me what's going on. And I will be forthcoming. So you be forthright. Tell me the truth. I will be forthcoming. I used that to lead the IBM organizations I was responsible for and the IBM technical team, as I ultimately was responsible for that before I graduated from IBM. So it's that basic, Pat. I jokingly say this, you've heard me say this yourself. If you're going to be bad in your career, be bad very early so that you get a chance to kind of make up for it and move forward. So I was fortunate that this was way back in like 1974, I think, that early on in my career, that I made such a horrible, horrible, horrible mistake and learned from it and got better because of it. I'll leave it there.
Well, as you point out, it's a gift from God to get it that young, but then to be willing, in other words, to get that feedback,
Yeah.
to be willing, and then to sit quietly. I imagine you sitting quietly with yourself and making a new paradigm,
Yeah.
like having a paradigm shift in your early 30s
Yep.
that shaped the rest of your career
Yep.
in many ways.
Well, it kind of fits the theme here, right? If nothing changes, Pat, nothing changes. So, like,
Amen.
if all you're getting is what you've been getting and you're not happy with that, and they weren't, and I wasn't, do something about it. Change.
Mm.
Mm.
So you mentioned a little bit ago the word loneliness,
Yeah,
and I feel like the theme in the book is collaboration, and you have many many friends, and it's obvious from the people that interview you, or excuse me, that your co-author interviewed,
yeah,
uh, that you're very close with a lot of these people, and but also they give some unvarnished feedback, what your strengths and weaknesses were.
sure.
But it seems to me when you're leading 200,000 employees, like there's only so much of you to go around. And it just occurred to me that it's a lonely business in general when you're trying to create strategy and move an organization forward and get people to work together who are, as you point out in the book, girding their loins.
Yeah.
They have different, they're not always aligned in their initiatives. And I was wondering if you could talk as a very senior corporate executive and what you remember about the loneliness of being in that position.
So it's interesting you put it that way. I don't know that I ever felt lonely per se. I was, I guess I was pretty, what's the right word here? It's not self confident. I was comfortable with myself. I was comfortable with the decisions I was making. But, Pat, as you pointed out, I'm Italian, so I'm an emotional guy. I don't, you know, I'm not afraid to let people know when I'm happy, when I'm sad, or when I'm angry or upset. And I could do that. I mean, way back then, this is back in the early 1990s, yeah, or 1990s. IBM even had a television network, Pat. And we actually had to go on the television network, the IBM television network, like weekly to kind of update the team we were leading. And of course, I was then leading the mainframe team, in the Mid Hudson Valley. And we had to do some very, very difficult and challenging things. And I'd go on that network, and, we had to lay off half the people in the Mid Hudson Valley, some 30,000. Not an easy thing to do. I cried several times on those calls, Pat. So yes, leadership is lonely, but I surrounded myself with a team of people who were enabled to help do what needed to be done, and I was there to help them do that. So I was not afraid. I was not afraid to trust you. I was not afraid to work with you. I wasn't going to do this all by myself. We're going to do it transparently. We're going to be open. We're going to be collaborative, and we're going to be responsible. And maybe that's the point you want to focus on, Pat. No
Okay.
matter what, I felt responsible for whatever IBM asked me to do. Whether I created the problem or not was immaterial. When they made
Mm-hmm.
it my problem and said, "This is what you've got to do," um, that was it. I owned it. Nobody else owned it anymore, just me.
Mm-hmm.
And I was able to live my life that way, right? Solving problems that mattered, that IBM asked me to step up and do. I owned the problem. It's my fault now. It's nobody else's fault. And you've heard me say this as well, Pat. I don't blame the people, the workers, the technical people, the technicians, the directs on the line. Errors like we made at IBM, they were not their fault. Those errors were our fault.
Mm.
Their leadership's fault. And I don't think leadership takes enough responsibility and ownership for what it does or doesn't do. Um,
Mm.
but I took it personally. A lot of times people will tell you, well, it's only a job, don't take it personally. How can you not take it personally? You're working 80, 90, 100 hours a week. What
Mm-hmm.
do you mean, don't take it personally? Of
Mm-hmm.
course you're going to take it personally. it's who I am. It's my ethos. It's my life. And in my case, for 44 years, it was that. So
Mm-hmm.
please don't ever tell me not to take it personally. I'm going to, and you want people to take it personally. That's the difference you're looking for. So I think this issue, the issue of how this all unfolds, how this happens, if you're a good leader, you have to have trust and faith in the people you pick, and you have to be their enabler too, Pat. You can't be doing
Mm-hmm.
their jobs for them. If
Mm-hmm.
you and me are working and I tell you to cover the right flank and I'll cover the left flank, I have to assume you're going to cover the right flank. And that's if you need me, you're going to call me and say, Nick, I need more help over here. If I don't hear from you, then I'm assuming you are covering the right flank until we can get together and compare notes, and we'll try to do that on a weekly basis. So, you know, it's not complicated. That's how you get to this. While you are a leader, and leadership is lonely, I agree with you. It can be fun when you become the enabler, Pat. So
Mm-hmm.
you're trusting, which is what I didn't do as that early upstart, manager. I didn't trust anybody because I knew better. I mean, I actually
Mm-hmm.
did know better. I mean, I,
Mm-hmm.
I don't want to be like a jerk here, but I could have probably designed their circuits better than they were designing them. That wasn't the point. That
Mm-hmm.
was no longer my job. My job was to make sure they did their job better and better. And then as time went on, of course, they did it much better than I could ever do it. So
Mm-hmm.
I think this idea of leadership is all about constantly being aware of what and where are you in the scheme of things. I remember once John Opel told me, Nick, being a good leader often means you can't be with the team you're leading. Sometimes you're in front of them, sometimes you're behind them, sometimes you're on the side, but you're not always directly with them. And
Mm-hmm.
he was a wise man. He had that right, and I use that all the time. I could be with you as your leader, but I could also be in front of you. I could also be behind you, on the side of you. I am your leader, and I am responsible for what has happened. And with me, if you so choose to stay, we will fix this and we will
Mm-hmm.
make things better. But if you don't own it, Pat, you're a fool because everybody who works for you knows it's your fault.
Mm-hmm.
And you're starting way behind the power curve in terms of credibility when you're blaming everybody else. So that's just a Nick Donofrioism. I lived my life that way. That's how I got to 78 years old. That's probably the way I'm going to die. So if I'm engaged, I own it. It's not your
Mm-hmm.
fault. We'll fix these problems.
Mm-hmm.
We'll identify them. Chances are the reason we're in this mess isn't because of something you did. It's because of some decisions we made.
Mm. Again, collaboration, cooperation. Um, you were, in my estimation, you were on the leading edge of diversity and inclusion. I think a lot of the senior collaborative partners you had were women in the book,
Yeah,
and Linda Sanford in particular.
yeah,
Could you talk a little bit about that?
sure. Okay, so again, I'm a pre-baby boomer. It wasn't all white man's world as I walked into the technical community of whatever chip building, computer building, and I immediately understood and noticed and said to myself, "This makes so little sense. We don't. All we're talking to is ourselves. Our voices are echoes, of each other." So that stuck in my mind early on. Um, And then, I have a wonderful wife who is a powerful leader unto herself. I had a wonderful mother who was a powerful leader unto herself. So I had good uh, viewable, understandable, reason to kind of say people like them are not in this discussion. So how good can this discussion actually be? Um, and therefore, I started to kind of better understand IBM. At somewhere along the line, Pat, I actually made IBM my company and not their company. That's also an
Mm.
important pivot when you kind of take ownership. I
Mm.
understood the Watson family. I understood Watson Senior. I read all the books. Watson Junior. I actually knew, um,
Mm.
and every other CEO since then. Um,
Mm.
so it became obvious to me that Watson Senior had it right. He had a sense about this issue of diversity, equity, and inclusion. It was like, how did this guy from Painted Post, New York? I mean, nobody even knows where Painted Post, New York is.
Mm.
How did this guy figure this out in the 1920s and 30s when that's not what was happening? It was mostly white men. There
Mm.
were no women. People of color were, as you well know, they were still kind of separate but equal kind of thinking going on. But he understood this differently. He somehow had figured it out that, hey, let's put all the moral issues aside, put your religious issues aside. It's all about business.
Mm.
If we want better business, well, these people have to be engaged. Women
Mhm.
have to be part of the workplace.
Mhm.
Um, there's that famous picture of the all women sales class at Endicott, New York. That's where everyone was trained back in the day. Um, that's him. He made that happen,
Mhm.
according to legend and folklore. He said, I wanted all women's sales class because he
Mhm.
went to every one of them. He went to them to kick them off, and then he went to them to graduate them. Smart guy. He had it figured out. Equal pay for equal work. He didn't care about the color of your skin, what you believed, who you were, how you thought, as long as you were a good IBMer and a good worker. And of course, back then, Pat, I mean, honestly, that IBM was a bit different, right? That was full employment. You heard those words, I'm sure. Those were
Mhm.
the reasons people went to work for IBM because they never laid anybody off. If they removed you, it was for cause, and even removing you was like, just don't let me ever see you again.
Mhm.
Chances are you still had a job, but you were just somewhere else. So that kind of made sense to me. So I grabbed it. IBM was one of the founders of NACME, the National Action Council for Minorities and Engineering.
Mm.
Um, I believe I believe it was Opal who was on their board, and then Kerry was on their board, and then me. And I was on that board for 20 years, and I chaired it for my last 5. It became very obvious to me we needed more women, we needed more people of color, and the more we had of this diversity, the better the results were, the better the answer was.
Mm.
Um, Carried that to an ultimate extreme, as you know, with the National Innovation Initiative for the Council on Competitiveness back in uh, 2002, 3, 4, 5. We did that work for them. I led part of that effort. Um, and then we kind of described for everyone what an innovative environment was all about. And it had everything to do with diversity, equity, and inclusion. Open, collaborative, multidisciplined, and broad based in its thinking, starting with the problem and not the answer. Simple
Mm.
formula, so true, even today.
Mm.
Even today. You can still get
Yeah.
that report, by the way, from the Council on Competitiveness's website. Um, so, Pat, I made it all about innovation, all about business, all about doing what's right, all about sustainability, all about understanding the consequences of your actions. There's no better way to do that than to do that with an enabled, diverse, equitable, and inclusive environment.
Thank you.
Sure.
So back to Rondout Creek, the guy in the back of his boat smoking a cigar.
Yeah.
He had very strong opinions. And
Why would that not surprise me?
so he said, in his opinion, not my opinion, his opinion, he said Nick should have been CEO.
Uh-huh.
And with no disrespect intended, obviously, on my part, to any other CEOs that came along at IBM, I feel like you had broad support, and it would have been logical for you to be CEO at some point. How do you feel about that statement?
Um, it is interesting, and I'm flattered by it. And look, I knew I might have been a contender for the job, but I also knew my strengths and I knew my weaknesses. I knew what was going on at the time. And, not to make it simple, age matters, experience matters. And, you know, you can't control how old you are. You can certainly get older if you take care of yourself, but you were born when you were born, and the timing was never quite right, Pat. Just to be candid with you, right? I I'm roughly 5 years younger than Gerstner and 5 years older than Sam. I'm kind of in the middle. It's like, oh boy, too bad. Um, and I'm not trivializing this, so I'm not saying that's the reason that they made their decisions. But I've had lots of conversations with lots of people about this topic. I've talked to other people who were asked to consider leading IBM and turned them down. And we've compared notes. Um, so Pat, no regrets, none whatsoever. Um, I when they chose Lou Gerstner, it was fine with me. I had a job to do. I was leading the mainframe business at the time, trying to turn it around, change it up, fix it up. It was their choice. Lou is an interesting and different kind of person, and clearly an outsider, but very smart, very, very hardworking, very committed. And I'd like to think that in some sense I helped him succeed in holding the IBM company together. Because at the time they were gonna separate us. They were going to, and we were in the let go company. We weren't in the stay company. We were in the let go company. So he, he did all the right things holding us together. And I was happy to learn from him and to work with him. And then, of course, with Sam. And as I knew Ginny very, very well for many, many years. And of course, I know Arvin very well. I mean, he used to work at IBM Research, and I was responsible for IBM Research. So, yeah, I consider myself blessed to literally have known personally every CEO except Watson Sr. I mean, I knew who he was, but I never shook his hand, and I never was in a meeting with him. I feared him, most of the time when I was early on at 64 with IBM. But every other one, I can honestly tell you, I knew him.
I have one last question for you, but before we get to that, is there anything that we're leaving out that you might like to talk about, or
Well,
anything?
yeah, I mean, I can become philosophical here, and that's dangerous for an engineer who took Psych 1 and very little philosophy. Pat, I think the toughest things, even now as I reflect on my career, that stand out are the things that dealt with family. We moved a lot as a family, arguably too much. Could have moved even more. Uh, had opportunities to leave IBM, stayed. Um, it's not, those are the tougher decisions for you, for anyone. Those are the lasting decisions. You don't know what you're doing. You know, there is no book that you're looking at. You know, my wife, am I listening to her or is she just echoing what I said? Does she really want to do these things? Does she really want me to do these things? Our kids, how stable are they? They're being moved every other year. Is that a wise thing to do? How well do they actually seem to be adjusting and taking? Are we taking good care of them as we try to raise them into good people, good citizens, difference makers? So I'd have to say to you, I give my mom and dad all the credit for putting the base in place, me, but I give my wife total credit for shaping me into the human being that I am, and my kids for raising the father that I am. I have never stopped learning from either my wife as her husband and partner for life, or my children as their father. Um, I became a better person because of them, not because of me. I mean, I've tried to influence them along the way and help them, get better at what they do. But their influence on me is much more profound and much more impactful than my influence on them. And we tend to overlook that. And as I reflect on many of those decisions, Pat, they weren't making them because they wanted them to be that way. They were making them to be supportive of me. And I looked by that too many times, way too
Mm.
many times.
If you had to describe yourself to a stranger as objectively as possible, how would you describe yourself? Who is Nick Donofrio?
I'd say he is first and foremost um, a problem solver. That engineering basis inside him shows up everywhere. I'm all about. I am all about taking science and technology and applying them to solve the problems of everyday life. I mean, that's who I am. I carry that forward into the individual that I am. I'm fun loving. I laugh a lot. I cry a lot. I love a lot. And I don't hate a lot. I love a lot. There's a handful of people in this world, Pat, that I particularly don't ever want to see again. But I figure after 78 years, if it's only one handful of people, that's not so bad. Um, so if you want someone who isn't afraid to have the courage of their conviction, to be on the right side of history, if that's who you want me.
Mm. I, thank you for that. And but I also wanted to say, like, you've helped so many people, and maybe that's a component of your problem solving ability. Like, you see a need, and you see a person who can fit that need, and you put the two together. But I just know, well, clearly you've helped me tremendously, but you've helped so many
I
people.
think I think that's it, Pat. I don't mean to be aseptic or cold when I say problem solving, but I approach everything, every challenge you've ever given me, I approach,
Mm.
as an engineer. I'm
Hmm.
I'm always about, you know, What are the moving parts? What is the root cause? If we do this, does it really fix the problem, or does it make it worse, or does it
Mm.
make it worse later, even though it fixes it now? So I think we're stuck. I mean, my wife Anita, she hates that ability. I mean, we're having dinner. We're talking. She'll say, "There you go again. I can tell you're looking at what problem are you solving now?" Like, well, maybe we could fix that part. Maybe the air duct is moving too fast, or She says, "Can you just stop?" I said, "Yeah, I stop when I sleep." I
Right.
said, but other than that, no.
The
Everything.
solution is so
Yeah,
obvious.
that's exactly. I say that. It's like, well, what am I supposed to do with that? I know what the answer is. What am I supposed to do now? So yeah, I have the burden of the truth, right?
Amen.
Amen.
Well, thank you so much. I really appreciate it. And I feel like we could talk all day,
Indeed.
but maybe we could do it again.
Absolutely, Pat. Thanks for having me.
Yeah.
Sincerely appreciate that. Appreciate you very much. And good luck with this podcast, Pat.
Thank you, sir.
You're welcome, sir.
Bye, Nick.
Cheers.
If you enjoy the most fascinating podcast in the world, please follow on Spotify, subscribe on YouTube, and follow on Apple Podcast.